Although it may surprise you, even though I'm a theology professor, I'm actually more concerned about how smartphones affect my own kids than aggressive atheists. Let me explain what I mean. Quite obviously, the defining characteristic of this generation is that they are digital natives. If we want to understand how this generation thinks and sees the world, it's through the lens of a smartphone. I mean, think about it. Many teens today have swiped smartphones before they could talk or read. Teens put technology in the same category as air and water. It's not a luxury, it's a given for them. Earlier generations learned to communicate online. So I'm from Gen X, and communicating offline was natural to me. I learned how to communicate online. And yet Gen Zers, what comes natural to them is how to communicate online. Many have to communicate offline. So how do we engage this generation that is so seeing the world through a smartphone? Well, I'm going to give two principles that my wife and I use with our kids that I trust will be encouraging and helpful to you. But keep something in mind. Josh and Doug and the DYM team didn't call me and say, Sean, you're a perfect parent with technology. Will you come tell our parents how to nail this? I am anything but a flawless parent. I'll be honest with you. I spend a lot of time apologizing to my kids for times that I blow it. So please consider this talk just learning from my successes, learning from my failures, and a lot of research that I've done on Gen Z. So let's jump into principle number one. And I think it's pretty straightforward, and it's this. Have reasonable technological boundaries with your kids. Set reasonable technological boundaries. You know, it's interesting, if we look at the life of King David, which was in chaos, one of his sons murdered one of his other sons, one of his sons raped one of his other daughters. What's interesting about this is 1 Kings 1:6 says, his father, referring to Absalom, had never at any time displeased him by asking, why have you done thus and so? In other words, David never disciplined his kids. Today, it's our job to discipline and set reasonable boundaries with our kids. Now, I've really come to believe that a lot of conflict takes place across different generations because we don't set good expectations and boundaries with our kids. In fact, I think conflict comes from different expectations. So imagine that you sit down with a high school kid. I would guess if you're a Gen Xer, maybe a boomer, maybe you're a millennial, probably you assume that when you sit down with a human being over coffee or something, you put smartphones away and only bring it out if you're looking at something together. This is often not the expectation that a young person has. They think it's fine to have their smartphones out. They might be looking at the same Instagram photos or TikTok videos. My point is not that one's better than another, but my point is that so often conflict takes place across generations because we don't have reasonable boundaries and set them clearly. So for me, with my students in high school and also at Biola, I set very clear boundaries and hold my students to it. And I found for the vast majority of young people, if we have reasonable boundaries and we stick to it, they honor that and in fact want boundaries. So here's how this looked with my own son. I wrote a blog and we're gonna make this article available to you. And I called it, My Son Got a Phone at 14 and a Half, Here's Why. Now, why did I give it to him at 14 and a half? Well, as a parent, I feel a huge responsibility to protect my son from some of the dangers that come with a smartphone. Protect him emotionally, morally, intellectually. In fact, my parents kind of did this with a car. My dad is sometimes a little over the top. He used to call a car a death machine to make sure we understood how dangerous a car could potentially be. But my parents didn't just say we could drive when we turned 16. They said, you turned 16, but you also have to show us that you're responsible before we let you drive. Well, that's why I wait to give my kids a smartphone. But there's a second reason that I think might be helpful to you, is we didn't say to our kids, when you're 13, you get a smartphone immediately, because that gives over your power in the life of your kids. You see, I see my kids' desire for a smartphone as an opportunity to teach them responsibility. Don't give up that power. So again, my parents did this with a car. They'd say, hey, when you're 16, you don't automatically get a car. You have to show us that you're responsible and can handle this before we give you a car. So for my wife and I, with our kids, my son had to show us that there was a grade component to it, There was a respect for his family and siblings. And there was just showing us that he had maturity to handle it. And at 14 and a half, we felt like he was ready. Now, I actually had my son sign a smartphone contract that I put together, and we were going to make this available to you. A friend sent it to me. He tweaked it. I took it and tweaked it. We're going to make it available to you. You can use it as it is, or you can tweak it as well. But here's some of the boundaries that we put in place with our kids. For example, we have all of our kids' passcodes. We have all my son's passcodes for all of his apps. We also have a rule that phones are not in the room. We don't have phones in rooms. Second, my son turns it in at 9 o'clock. He also has to ask if he's going to download anything. We have a rule that there's no porn, none at all. We also say, you're going to mess up, you're going to break these rules, and we're going to take the phone away, and we'll renegotiate, and we'll come back. Now, you can come up with the rules that work for technology in your home. But I have found, and studies show when it comes to this generation, they actually want reasonable boundaries with technology. So if we come up with reasonable boundaries, if we state them, if we explain why, and we're consistent to them, the vast majority of young people will respond. Well, there's a second principle that I found I actually enjoy most with my kids, and it's this. It's to look for opportunities to engage with technology. Look for opportunities to engage with technology. So I wrote a book recently with a friend of mine called So the Next Generation Will Know. And the principle of this book was not to say, here's a whole new plan for parenting. Rather, the whole premise was, if we just open our eyes and we look around, we will see opportunities in front of us that are there if we're just looking for them. So we're calling for parents to look differently. So Deuteronomy 6:4-7, a famous passage in the Old Testament, it says this. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you get up." In other words, we have a responsibility to intentionally teach our kids biblical truths. So in my son, I look for an opportunity, number one, in life events that happen. So when my son turned 13, I want him to have a rite of passage. So when he turned 13, and we actually have an article on this we're going to make available to you if that's helpful as well. But when my son turned 13, I thought, what are some growing up, becoming a man kind of things I could introduce him to? So I bought him an electric shaver. We watched his first R-rated movie, which of course was Braveheart and Gladiator. I took him to a shooting range. We're not really a gun family, but I wanted to learn safety training and get to shoot a gun. I took him driving in an empty parking lot. And then I had all these key men in his life come and share principles with him about becoming a man. Now that's a life opportunity that we can look for to influence our kids. But there's also certain opportunities that come up with technology that I encourage you to look for. So here's an example. My son came to me. He was 14, so not too long ago, and he wanted to see this movie about the rock band Queen called Bohemian Rhapsody. It's PG-13. I knew there were some sexual ideas in this, but I read and I thought, you know what, it's not too over the top. I said, all right, son, here's the deal. I'll take you and any of your friends who want to go, and their parents say it's cool. All I ask is when we're done, we come home, and then I just want to talk to you for 20, 30 minutes. I just want to know what you think about the movie. That's it. He goes, sure, Dad. So we go see the movie. We come back, sits down for 30 minutes. I say, hey, what'd you think? What'd you enjoy? Was this a good movie? What was your favorite scene? And I also said, what do you think was the main idea of this movie? How do you think as Christians we should think about this film? And we just watched it, and we talked about it together. It was a way of taking something he wanted to do and tied to technology and media and saying, let's redeem it for good. Another example, my son came to me during the famous quarantine. He goes, Dad, you really need to start a TikTok video. I was like, yeah, I don't know. I've got enough social media things. And I thought about it. He goes, here's what we'll do. We'll make videos together. And I thought, what a great opportunity. Now, I'm not saying you should start a TikTok. Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't, but this worked for me. So my son and I have made videos together, but he also saw me doing funny videos about basketball, about Jordan shoes, about my comic book collection, about my neighbor having this Thor hammer, like funny stuff, but also using TikTok to teach a Christian worldview. See, these are opportunities. If we look for them, they're there. In fact, sometimes when we're traveling in an airport, I've said to my kids, I've said, hey, just sit down for a minute, and I want you to people watch. Just watch how people use technology. Watch how it affects the way they walk. Watch how it affects the way they relate. Watch how close they look at it, how long they look at it. And we just sit there and we observe and have a conversation about how people use technology. I'll give you a couple more examples. And again, you can use all these, you can use none of these. But in April of 2020 was actually the 25th year anniversary, for lack of a better term, since the Oklahoma City bombing. And when it started to come up in April, I thought, gosh, my kids weren't even born for this. So I got together, I said, all right, one night this week, we're gonna watch the PBS show on the Oklahoma City bombing. I just want them to be educated. So my two older kids watched it, and we just talked about what happened in America. And then afterwards, I had a chance on my YouTube channel. I interviewed a lady by the name of Jean Bishop, and she wrote a book, an unbelievable story about how the father of the Oklahoma City bomber, McVeigh, actually he's the father of Timothy McVeigh, and the father of one of the victims, because of their Catholic faith, reconciled relationship together and became friends. And the whole theme of this book, and interviewing her, I had tears in my eyes, was that even out of the worst domestic terror attack in American history, goodness came out of that, and reconciliation and forgiveness. So we watched a show one night, at dinner we watched the interview, and we just talked about it. Now, I don't do this stuff with my kids all the time, but I'm just looking for regular opportunities, kind of in the rhythm of life, to use technology positively to engage them. Now, I'm about to share something. Some of you might seriously judge me on this, but I'm going to be honest about it. My son came to me this past week. He goes, Dad, I've started watching Rick and Morty. Now, this is a show, to be honest, I don't like this show at all. It's a little bit like Family Guy. My wife can't handle it. But one of the dances I try to have with my kids, I don't want to be, the older they get, I want to give them more freedom to make choices, and I don't want to be legalistic. So I allowed my son to start watching this as he got older. He came to me this week and he goes, Dad, there's this show on Rick and Morty, and they had a scene where they brought Jesus in. Will you sit down and watch it with me? I want to know what you think. I thought, you know what? That's what I'm trying to do as a parent. I want to look for these opportunities in the context of a relationship to help my son think Christianly. So friends, it's natural when we look at technology to be afraid. Sometimes you just say, get rid of it and get defensive. I have been there and I've made those mistakes. But I would encourage you to think about technology as an opportunity. Number one, set healthy boundaries in your family. And number two, shift your thinking to look for natural opportunities in front of you. Rather than shutting down all technology, once you have smart boundaries that are there, use technology to engage your kids in conversation and teach them a Christian worldview.